I want to talk to you about rights and responsibilities. Those two things should always go together. Now, there's a couple of ways to look at this subject. One is, it's an issue for parents, as men, as fathers, as we try to raise our children. We want to inculcate in them the understanding that for every right, there's an associated responsibility, but it has application to us as adults as well, because whether you're an adult or child, everywhere there's a right, there's a responsibility attached to it. Those two things go together. It's not like they're free floating and you find ways to match them up. It's that there is no such thing as one without the other. It's like two sides. Every coin has two sides to it. So in teaching it to children, they naturally think of, okay, well, my older brother or sister gets certain rights. I want to have those rights too. Why can't I have them? And a lot of times we give, the answer, well, they're older and when you're that age. And there's a certain sense in which it's valid to offer that reasoning. But as soon as possible, we should always try to match it up with responsibility. Yes, your older brother has that right, but he has this responsibility. In fact, the whole reason we get rights is because we have responsibilities. So this takes us into the realm of adults. The Constitution has as its first 10 amendments what we call the Bill of Rights. These are rights that citizens have. And the reason they have those rights is because they have certain responsibilities. Our nation was founded by, generally speaking, God-fearing people. More specifically, most of them were Protestant Christians. They read the Bible. Most people who learned how to read in colonial America learned how to read by reading the King James edition of the Bible. That's the first book they read. That's the book with which they were most familiar. And it taught a certain number of rights, but those rights were all based on our responsibilities. So, for example, why should a man have freedom of religion? Because God calls him to worship. And because there were various Protestant denominations, they didn't want to impinge on each other's rights to worship. And so the idea was that Congress could not pass a law enforcing a national religion like they'd had in England, which was the place from which most of the people had come, and they had a national church. Now, I think it was roughly half the colonies each had their own state churches, each colony had a church. In the Northeast, there were largely congregational churches. In the Southeast, there were mainly Anglican churches. That is derived from the Church of England, but not officially a part of it. And the Bill of Rights, as originally written, put no restrictions on the colonies or the states. It was only restrictions on the national government. And it was only after the Civil War and the passage of the 14th Amendment that the Bill of Rights began to be applied to the states as well. But back in colonial times and early American history, the states, an individual state could have a church, an official church for the state, which roughly half of them did, and they would, out of tax money, they would pay the ministers, and there was a very, very, very tight connection. So the founders of the country weren't at all trying to eliminate religion from public discourse. They were trying to make sure that the federal government didn't come in and impose some religious solution that they didn't want. But the reason for all this freedom was fundamentally the responsibility that the Bible assigns to every family, and therefore every man is the leader of that family, to worship God, to worship and serve God, to honor him with their lives. So you need freedom of religion in order to follow your conscience. You read the Bible and you follow your conscience to obey him. And that in that way, rights and responsibilities go together. But today you'll notice in society, those things are completely people think of rights all the time without thinking of responsibilities. I remember when the healthcare movement at some point came out with we've got to have a healthcare bill of rights, and these are the rights that all people have. But I don't remember anyone associating those rights with responsibilities. But this is built into the very fabric of nature. It's built in the fabric of the human conscience that rights and responsibilities should go together. After all, we're born into this world narcissistic. We're babies. We care only about ourselves. We're born in this world. We got no concern for anybody else. We're only concerned about ourselves. And, that continues through young childhood, and it'll continue indefinitely if it's never trained out of us. That's the whole point of having a mother and father. To discipline us is to train that narcissism has to be trained out of us. That resistance to responsibility and grasping for rights is bound up in our sinful nature, that we're born with, and so it's got to be trained out of us, and that's why we teach our children the Bible. That's why we teach ourselves the Bible. And you can look around today and see a lot of adults that were never disciplined, and they just expect everything to be handed to them. That's why it said that we live in an age of entitlement. And when you live in an age of entitlement, giving thanks doesn't come naturally because you just think you're entitled. So I think at the earliest age, it's important to teach children to know that there is no such thing as gaining a right without gaining a corresponding responsibility. I remember as a teenager when I learned how to drive, it was understood from my parents that, first of all, I was responsible for obeying all the traffic laws if I had a driver's license. And right after that, I was expected to help out with any, chauffeuring responsibilities, like in the family. Like if my younger brothers had to go somewhere, be somewhere. Now, not that my parents were anxious to endanger my younger brothers by putting them in the car with me. They were wise to not only make sure I got proper training before I got a license, but even after I had it, to be on sort of a short leash and learn how to drive and take care of myself before they'd entrust anybody else to my driving. But the point is that yes, if you've got a car, you got to chip in and help out with those responsibilities, and it goes right down the line. And we adults should think the same way. I mean, we have rights as American citizens. At least we still have some. And we should never think of those independently of thinking of the responsibilities that go with them. It's very similar to what we find in the Bible, the relationship between God's commandments and his promises. There are commandments and there are promises, and those two things go together. They shouldn't be separated. God is not going to command us something without some benefit accruing to us from that. So, for example, it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, and you should expect to live a long life. That's in the book of Ephesians. And certainly, if you obey your parents and they tell you, hey, don't play in the traffic, and you obey your parents and you don't play in the traffic, then you're going to live longer than the other kids who are playing in the traffic. Now, that's kind of a silly example, but it is pretty obvious and pretty reasonable to expect that obedience leads to blessing. And responsibilities lead to rights. If you're assigned a responsibility, you need some kind of rights in order to exercise that responsibility. And conversely, if you have certain rights, then there must be certain responsibilities you're expected to fulfill. So that's the point, is don't ever let your kids and don't ever let yourself think of that they have a right or that you have a right that isn't tethered to some responsibility that must be fulfilled, that must be kept, that must be heeded. And if we do that, then we will grow in maturity, will become more like Jesus Christ and less like infantile, narcissistic babies. God bless you.